Leo felt the weight of the room press down on him, a physical force as tangible as the heavy damask curtains that suffocated the windows. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted duck, was a cocktail of condescension he was forced to breathe. He was an island of worn corduroy in a sea of bespoke silk and tailored wool. His wife, Clara, navigated this sea like a shark, all polished teeth and predatory grace, leaving him adrift in her wake. This was her element, not his. Their annual winter gala was less a celebration and more a strategic display of power, a carefully curated exhibit of her family's perceived success. Leo, the part-time librarian and aspiring historian, was her least favorite part of the collection. A dusty, forgotten artifact she was obligated to display once a year. He clutched a glass of sparkling water, the condensation cold against his nervous fingers, and tried to blend into the ornate wallpaper. It was never successful. Sooner or later, someone would notice him. A portly man named Alistair, a banking colleague of Clara's brother, cornered him by the fireplace. "So, Leo," he boomed, his voice slick with patronage, "Clara tells me you're a historian. Still digging up bones, are we?" Leo offered a tight, polite smile. "Something like that. I'm currently researching medieval trade guilds. The socio-economic structures are fascinating." Before Alistair could offer another thinly veiled insult, Clara swept in. She placed a proprietary hand on Leo's arm, her grip like a velvet-covered vice. Her smile was dazzlingly bright and utterly cold. "Oh, darling, don't bore Alistair with your little hobbies." She turned her brilliant smile on the banker, a conspiratorial glint in her eye. "Leo is a romantic. He lives in his little books while the rest of us have to live in the real world." The small group around them chuckled, a sound like ice cubes rattling in an empty glass. Humiliation, sharp and hot, flooded Leo's chest. He felt his face flush. This was the ritual, the part of the evening where Clara reminded everyone, including him, of his place. He was the court jester, the harmless eccentric married into a dynasty. But it was what she said next that shattered the remaining fragments of his composure. Alistair, sensing blood in the water, pushed further. "Come now, Clara, everyone has their prime. I'm sure Leo had his moments. What would you say was your peak, old boy? University rugby team, a particularly well-written paper?" Leo opened his mouth to answer, to salvage some sliver of dignity. But Clara's laugh cut through the atmosphere like a blade. It was a beautiful, cruel sound. She looked directly at Leo, her eyes devoid of any warmth. "Oh, Alistair, you're too kind," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "My poor Leo, he peaked at nothing." The words hung in the air, brutal and absolute. The snickering died, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable silence. Even for this crowd, the cruelty was breathtaking. Leo felt every eye in the room on him, pitying, amused, dismissive. He was no longer a person, he was an anecdote, a cautionary tale. He could feel the old, tarnished silver key in his pocket, its familiar edges a stark contrast to the smooth, cold perfection of the room. He rubbed his thumb over its intricate head, a silent, desperate habit. He looked at his wife, the woman who had once claimed to love his mind, to admire his passion for the past. He saw a stranger, a woman whose soul had been hollowed out and replaced with a desperate hunger for status. He said nothing. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate motion, and excused himself, retreating from the circle of polite predators. He spent the rest of the night in the library, the only room in the house that felt like his, the silence a soothing balm on a fresh wound. The marriage had not always been this way. Leo remembered a different Clara, a girl with bright, curious eyes who would listen for hours as he spoke about forgotten kings and ancient empires. They had met in college, two bright minds from different worlds. He was a scholarship student, his family background modest but loving. She was the daughter of the formidable Eleanor Vance, a woman who measured the world in carats and square footage. In those early days, Clara had seemed different from her family. She had a rebellious streak, a supposed disdain for the shallow materialism that defined her mother's world. She was drawn to Leo's intellect, his quiet confidence, his passion for things that couldn't be bought or sold. He, in turn, was captivated by her fire, her sharp wit, and a vulnerability she showed to no one else. Their first few years of marriage were happy, lived in a small apartment filled with more books than furniture. He was working on his doctorate and she was starting her career in marketing. They had dreams, simple ones, of a life built around shared intellectual pursuits and mutual respect. But then her father passed away, and the Vance family money, managed by her brother Marcus, began to multiply. Or so it seemed. With the influx of wealth came a slow, insidious change in Clara. The small apartment was no longer enough. She needed a house, a grand one, in the most exclusive neighborhood. Her wardrobe, once stylish but modest, was replaced by a rotating collection of designer labels. Her friends, once a mix of artists and academics, were now exclusively the wives and husbands of the city's financial elite. Her family, particularly her mother Eleanor, fanned the flames of this transformation. Eleanor had only ever tolerated Leo, viewing him as a temporary bohemian phase her daughter was going through. As Clara's ambition grew, Eleanor saw her chance to mold her daughter into a true Vance. She whispered poison in Clara's ear, constantly comparing Leo to the powerful men their friends were married to. "A man's worth is in what he provides, darling," Eleanor would say, over brunch, her voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. "Leo is a sweet boy, but his passions don't pay for a summer in the Hamptons." Marcus, Clara's younger brother, was a product of his mother's teachings. He was arrogant, flashy, and worshipped at the altar of high-risk investments. He treated Leo with open contempt, often making jokes about his meager librarian salary at family dinners. "Hey, Leo," he'd sneer, "found any $1 million first editions in the stacks lately? No? Well, keep trying." Leo had tried to resist the tide. He had finished his doctorate but found the cutthroat politics of academia unfulfilling. He took a position at the city's central library, a job he loved, which gave him access to rare archives for his own research. He had hoped Clara would see the value in his happiness, in his pursuit of knowledge. Instead, she saw it as a monumental failure. It was a public declaration that he had no ambition, no drive to join her in the gilded cage she was so desperate to build. The intellectual connection that had been the bedrock of their love eroded, replaced by her resentment and his quiet disappointment. The humiliation at the gala was not a beginning, it was a culmination of 1,000 smaller cuts inflicted over years. After the guests had finally departed, their laughter echoing like ghosts in the cavernous hallway, Clara found Leo in his study. He hadn't bothered to change out of his corduroy jacket. He was staring at the wall, at a framed map of 14th century trade routes. "Are you going to sulk all night?" she asked, her voice sharp. She had kicked off her heels and was nursing a glass of wine. "You embarrassed me, Clara," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "I stated a fact. What have you accomplished, Leo, really? You have a degree nobody cares about and a job that barely pays for the gas in your car. A car that I bought for you, by the way." She took a sip of wine. "I'm tired of apologizing for you. I'm tired of having to explain to people what my husband does." Her words were meant to provoke a fight, but Leo was too numb to engage. He felt a profound sense of detachment, as if he were watching a scene from a play. He turned his attention from the map to a small wooden box on his desk. It had belonged to his grandfather, a man he had adored, a quiet, thoughtful man who had been a watchmaker by trade. "I'm meeting with Julian tomorrow," Clara announced, changing the subject. Julian was a real estate developer, a man who oozed wealth and ambition, everything she now claimed to admire. "We're looking at a property on the coast. He thinks we should invest." "We?" Leo asked, his voice barely a whisper. Clara sighed, a sound of pure exasperation. "Don't be deliberately obtuse. My money, Leo, my investment, something you know nothing about." She drained her glass and placed it on a stack of his books, leaving a dark red ring on a priceless manuscript. "I'm going to bed. Try not to wallow in your own mediocrity all night. It's a terribly unattractive look." She left, the scent of her expensive perfume lingering like a toxic cloud. Leo sat in the silence, the phrase "peaked at nothing" replaying in his mind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver key. It was old, the metal soft with age, the design of the head an intricate knot of what looked like stylized letters. It was his grandfather's. He had found it after the funeral, tucked into the lining of the old man's favorite tweed jacket, with no note, no explanation. He opened the wooden box on his desk. Inside were other mementos, a pair of spectacles, a worn leather wallet, and a small, leather-bound journal. He had tried to read the journal before, but his grandfather's handwriting was difficult, and the entries were cryptic, filled with strange names and numbers. Tonight, fueled by a potent cocktail of despair and a strange, burgeoning resolve, he opened it again. He turned the pages carefully, the old paper creaking like a church door. His eyes scanned the spidery script, and this time a phrase caught his attention. "Ethelred's legacy is secure. The key will show the way." Ethelred, the name resonated with him. Ethelred the Unready, an Anglo-Saxon king. It was a name from his world, the world of history Clara so despised. He flipped through more pages, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. He saw diagrams, columns of figures, and then, on a page near the end, a detailed hand-drawn sketch. It was a drawing of the key in his hand. Beneath it was a single line: Argentum clavis, Geneva. Silver key, Geneva. A spark ignited in the cold emptiness of his chest. It wasn't a plan, not yet. It was just a flicker of curiosity, a pull towards a mystery that was entirely his own. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with Clara or her suffocating world. He looked at the key, then back at the journal. A path was opening, leading away from the humiliation of the gala and towards something unknown. He had no idea what he would find, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving forward. The days that followed the gala were a study in escalating cruelty. Clara, emboldened by Leo's passive response to her public insult, dropped all pretense of a functioning marriage. She began seeing Julian openly, her affair becoming the talk of their social circle. She would come home late, smelling of another man's cologne, and offer no explanation, no apology. She treated Leo like a piece of furniture, an inconvenient fixture in the house she was already mentally redecorating. Her family was merciless. Eleanor would call the house, and upon hearing Leo's voice would sigh dramatically and say, "Oh, it's you. Is Clara there? I need to speak with someone who makes decisions." Marcus would send taunting text messages with pictures of him and Julian on a golf course, captioned, "This is what a real man's life looks like." They were a pack of wolves, convinced they had cornered a lamb. Their confidence was absolute, their contempt a constant simmering presence. They believed Leo was weak, a spineless academic with no resources and no fight left in him. They saw his quietness as surrender, his politeness as proof of his impotence. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they couldn't see the change happening behind his eyes. While they were busy dismantling his dignity, Leo was in his study, meticulously piecing together his grandfather's puzzle. The journal was his Rosetta Stone. He cross-referenced names and dates, using his skills as a historian to decipher the cryptic entries. He learned that his grandfather, the humble watchmaker, had been a mathematical prodigy in his youth. He had developed a series of algorithms in the early days of computational finance, revolutionary concepts that he had sold anonymously through a Swiss intermediary. The money from those sales hadn't been spent, it had been invested. The name Ethelred Industries appeared again and again in the journal. Leo researched it online. It was a massive, notoriously private global tech conglomerate. Its ownership was a famously impenetrable web of shell corporations and holding companies, with its headquarters listed in Luxembourg. It was known for its aggressive but brilliant investment strategies, often acquiring struggling companies and turning them into powerhouses. It was a ghost in the machine of the global economy, powerful and unseen. The journal hinted that his grandfather wasn't just an investor, he was the ghost, the founder, the architect. The final piece of the puzzle was a name and a number in the back of the journal, next to the drawing of the key. Mr. Alistair Sterling, legal counsel, called from a secure line. Leo used a prepaid burner phone he bought with cash from an electronics store downtown. He walked to a public park, sat on a cold bench, and dialed the international number. A crisp British voice answered on the first ring. "Sterling." "My name is Leo Vance," Leo said, his own voice sounding foreign to him. "My grandfather was Arthur Gable. I was told to call you. I have his key." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence so profound Leo thought the call had dropped. Then Sterling's voice returned, infused with a new energy. "Mr. Vance, we have been waiting for your call for a very long time. When can you be in Geneva?" Leo told Clara he was attending an academic conference in Switzerland, a symposium on Carolingian manuscripts. She laughed at the idea. "How quaint," she said, barely looking up from her phone where she was texting Julian. "Try not to spend too much. I'm cancelling your credit card at the end of the month. You'll need to learn to live on your own salary soon enough." "I'll manage," Leo said, the words carrying a double meaning she was utterly deaf to. He packed a small bag, his grandfather's journal, and the silver key tucked safely in his carry-on. The flight to Geneva was a journey between two worlds. He left one as Leo Vance, the failed husband, the man who peaked at nothing. He hoped to arrive in the other as someone else entirely. Geneva was clean, quiet and orderly, a world away from the chaotic drama of his life. Mr. Sterling met him at the hotel. He was an older man, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He carried an aura of quiet competence and absolute discretion. "Mr. Vance," he said, shaking Leo's hand firmly. "It is an honor. Your grandfather was one of the most brilliant men I ever had the privilege of knowing." The next morning, Sterling escorted Leo to a formidable stone building in the heart of the financial district. It was a private bank, the kind of institution that didn't have a name on the door because its clients already knew where it was. They were led through a series of silent, carpeted corridors to a subterranean level. The air grew colder. They stopped before a circular steel door that looked like it belonged on a submarine. A bank director, a stern-faced man named Dubois, met them there. He nodded curtly at Leo. "The key, if you please." Leo's hand trembled slightly as he produced the silver key. Dubois took it and inserted it into a small, almost invisible lock in the center of the vault door. He then turned to a digital panel and entered a long code. Finally, he placed his own hand on a biometric scanner. With a series of deep, satisfying clicks, the massive door swung inward, revealing a small, brightly lit chamber. "After you, Mr. Vance," Sterling said, his voice soft. Leo stepped inside. The room was not filled with gold bars or piles of cash. It was lined with safe deposit boxes, hundreds of them, each bearing a small engraved number. In the center of the room was a heavy mahogany table and a single chair. Dubois used the silver key on a master lock, then entered another code. One by one, he and his assistants began retrieving boxes and placing them on the table. Sterling opened the first one. It contained bearer bonds, thick stacks of them, issued by governments and corporations from around the world. The numbers printed on them were staggering. Another box contained deeds, properties in London, Tokyo, New York, commercial buildings, vast tracts of undeveloped land, a private island in the Caribbean. A third box held certificates for rare works of art, masterpieces by Monet, Rothko, and Degas, all held in climate-controlled storage facilities across the globe. The final, largest box contained only a single, thick leather portfolio. Sterling opened it and laid the documents on the table. They were the incorporation papers, the shareholder agreements, the foundational documents for Ethelred Industries and its dozens of subsidiary companies. And on every page, the name of the sole director and majority shareholder was the same, Arthur Gable. A complex trust was in place, naming his only grandson, Leo Vance, as the sole, undisputed heir upon his death. Leo sank into the chair, his legs suddenly weak. He stared at the mountain of paper, the evidence of a fortune so vast it was almost incomprehensible. Sterling began to explain the structure. His grandfather had built an empire in silence, a man who possessed unimaginable wealth but chose to live the simple life of a watchmaker. He despised the arrogance and vulgarity of the new rich and had constructed his entire financial world to be invisible, a silent engine humming beneath the surface of the global economy. "Your grandfather believed that true wealth was a tool, not a trophy," Sterling explained. "He used it to fund medical research, to support education, to quietly shape a better world, all from behind a curtain of absolute anonymity." Leo was speechless. He thought of his grandfather, a man who taught him to read, who smelled of pipe tobacco and wood polish, who had always had time to explain how a clock worked. He had never imagined this. But Sterling hadn't finished. He pulled out one last file, this one thin and modern. "There is one final matter, a more recent development that you should be aware of," he said, his tone turning grim. "One of Ethelred's investment arms, a subsidiary called North Star Capital, functions as a high-risk lender. They provide capital to smaller, aggressive financial firms." He opened the file. "A few years ago, North Star extended a significant line of credit to a boutique investment firm. This firm has been using the capital for incredibly reckless ventures, leveraging themselves to a dangerous degree. They have, in fact, violated several clauses in their loan agreement." He slid a document across the table. It was a list of the firm's partners. The name at the top of the list was Marcus Vance. Leo stared at his brother-in-law's name. It felt like a punch to the gut. "The Vance family portfolio, including your wife's assets, is managed entirely by this firm," Sterling continued, his voice cold and precise. "They are, to put it bluntly, completely dependent on the capital we provide. Their entire lifestyle, their house, their cars, the very clothes on their backs are funded by your money." He paused, letting the devastating irony sink in. "As the new owner of Ethelred Industries, you are their creditor. Their fate is, quite literally, In your hands, with a single phone call, you could recall the loans and their world would collapse like a house of cards. Leo sat back in the chair, the cold air of the vault chilling him to the bone. He looked at the silver key, still on the table. It was the key to a fortune, the key to a hidden legacy, but it was also the key to a reckoning. He thought of Clara's sneering face at the gala. He heard her voice, dripping with contempt, echoing in the silent vault. He peeked at nothing. A cold, hard clarity washed over him. The hurt, the humiliation, the years of quiet suffering. It all coalesced into a single point of icy resolve. He had never been a vengeful man. He believed in history, in cause and effect, in the slow, grinding wheels of justice. But sometimes, he realized, the wheels needed a firm, deliberate push. He looked up at Mr. Sterling, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice steady and clear, "tell me more about this loan recall process. I want to understand it perfectly." The decision was made in the silent, refrigerated air of the Swiss vault, but it was forged in the fires of a decade of humiliation. Leo returned from Geneva a different man. On the surface, he was the same quiet, unassuming historian. He went back to his job at the library. He nodded politely when Clara spoke to him. He endured the taunts from her family. But beneath the calm exterior, a powerful engine was turning. He was no longer a victim. He was a strategist. He met with Mr. Sterling and his team via encrypted video calls from a secure office Sterling had arranged for him in the city. It was a small, anonymous room in a nondescript building, a modern-day war room where he would orchestrate the systematic dismantling of the Vance Empire. The team Sterling had assembled was formidable: a forensic accountant, a ruthless corporate lawyer, and a public relations expert who specialized in reputation management. They laid out the plan with the precision of a military operation. It was designed to be elegant, surgical, and inescapable. They would use the Vance's own greed and arrogance as the weapon against them. "The key is to let the system do the work," the lawyer, a sharp woman named Ms. Davies, explained. "We don't need to be bullies. We simply enforce the terms of the contracts they so eagerly signed. We pull the threads and their entire tapestry will unravel." Phase 1 was initiated by the forensic accountant. He drafted an anonymous, highly detailed tip to the Securities and Exchange Commission, pointing out specific irregularities in the accounting practices of Marcus's firm. He included transaction codes and dates that could only have come from an insider, making the tip impossible for the agency to ignore. "They'll be under federal audit within a week," the accountant said with a grim smile. "It will freeze their ability to move assets. They'll be trapped." Phase 2 was the loan recall. Ms. Davies drafted the official notice from North Star Capital. It cited multiple breaches of the loan covenants, specifically the clause regarding excessive risk. The notice demanded immediate and full repayment of the principal and interest, a sum totaling over $200 million. Phase 3 was the most personal. Julian, Clara's new lover, ran a high-profile property development company. Sterling's team discovered that his company was also heavily leveraged, with a significant portion of its funding coming from a bank that was, unknown to him, a recent acquisition of Athelred Industries. They would initiate a hostile takeover bid, offering his shareholders a generous premium that his board, facing the reality of his precarious finances, would be unable to refuse. Leo listened to it all, a quiet commander absorbing the details of his campaign. He felt a strange detachment, a historian's perspective on the fall of a minor corrupt dynasty. He gave the final authorization. "Proceed," he said, his voice calm. Mr. Sterling made the calls. The anonymous email was sent. The couriers were dispatched with the legal notices. The first domino had been pushed. All Leo had to do now was wait and watch. The first sign of the coming storm appeared a few days later. Leo was in the kitchen making coffee when Marcus burst into the house, his face pale and slick with sweat. He bypassed Leo completely and stormed into the living room where Clara was on the phone, laughing about a planned spa weekend with Julian. "We have a problem," Marcus said, his voice tight with panic. "A big one. We're being audited. The SEC, they're freezing everything." Clara's laughter died. "What are you talking about? Handle it. That's what we pay you for." Her voice was annoyed, as if he were complaining about a leaky faucet. "You don't understand," he hissed. "This isn't a routine check. Someone talked. They know where to look. They know everything." Leo watched them from the doorway, sipping his coffee. He offered a look of mild concern. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his tone gentle. Clara shot him a venomous glare. "This doesn't concern you, Leo. Go back to your books." The next domino fell the following afternoon. A legal courier arrived at the door with a thick envelope addressed to Marcus Vance. Leo signed for it. He placed it on the marble-topped hall table and went back to his study. An hour later, he heard a shattered scream. He found Clara and Marcus in the living room, staring at the documents spread across the coffee table. It was the loan recall notice from North Star Capital. "200 million?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "They want it back now. They can't do that." "They can," Marcus croaked, his face ashen. "We're in breach. We're ruined, Clara. Utterly ruined." Disbelief was quickly replaced by panic. They spent the next 48 hours in a frantic state of damage control. Marcus called every contact he had, begging for a bridge loan for an extension for mercy. Doors that had always been open were slammed shut in his face. The news of the SEC audit had already poisoned the well. No one would touch them. Eleanor arrived at the house, her usual icy composure cracked, revealing the raw fear beneath. "What is this I hear?" she demanded. "What has that incompetent boy done?" When Marcus explained the situation, she refused to accept it. "This is impossible. The Vances do not fail. Call our friends, call the bank. Someone will fix this." But no one could. The system they had so skillfully manipulated for years was now closing in on them, its gears grinding with terrifying efficiency. The cascade effect was swift and brutal. With their assets frozen and the loan recalled, their firm was insolvent overnight. The news broke on the financial channels and their company stock plummeted to zero. The press, smelling a scandal, began circling. Reporters started showing up outside their gated community. Clara tried to use her credit cards to book a suite at a hotel, a desperate attempt to escape the chaos. They were all declined. The repossession trucks arrived the next day, towing away her prized Maserati and Marcus's Porsche. An eviction notice was pasted on their front door. The grand mansion, it turned out, was mortgaged to the hilt with the very bank that now wanted its money back. Through it all, Leo remained a quiet observer. He made coffee in the mornings. He went to work at the library. He offered polite, useless sympathy when Clara would break down in a rage-fueled panic. "This is a nightmare," she screamed at him one evening, her face blotchy from crying. "Our lives are over, and you just sit there. Why don't you do something?" "What can I do, Clara?" he asked, his voice soft with feigned helplessness. "I don't have any money. I don't know any of your powerful friends." His quiet reasonableness was more infuriating to her than any argument would have been. It highlighted his complete separation from her world, a world that was now burning to the ground. The final blow came for Julian. The news of the hostile takeover bid by Ethelred Industries was announced. His company's stock soared as shareholders clamored to accept the generous offer. Julian's board, seeing a golden parachute, turned on him, voting to approve the sale. He was out. He called Clara not to offer comfort, but to scream at her. "This is your family's fault. Your brother's toxic reputation has tainted me. We're finished." He hung up on her, severing the final tie to the life she had been trying to build. She was left with nothing. Her wealth, her lover, her social standing, all of it was gone, evaporating in less than a week. All she had left was the house for a few more days, and the quiet, useless husband she so thoroughly despised. She looked at him sitting in his armchair reading a book, a picture of infuriating calm amidst the wreckage of her life, and a dark, irrational suspicion began to form in her mind. The day the movers came was grey and overcast, the sky the colour of ash. They moved with a practiced, impersonal efficiency, stripping the house of its opulent furnishings, leaving behind ghostly outlines on the walls and carpets. Each piece of furniture that crossed the threshold was a fresh wound for Clara, a tangible symbol of her catastrophic fall. She, Eleanor, and Marcus stood in the cavernous, echoing living room. The grandeur was gone, replaced by a stark, pathetic emptiness. They were three shipwrecked survivors on a barren island of their own making. Marcus was muttering to himself, pacing back and forth. Eleanor stood ramrod straight, her face a mask of stone, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her terror. Clara was simply numb, wrapped in a cashmere throw that was soon to be repossessed. It was into this scene of final despair that Leo walked. He wasn't dressed in his usual corduroy, but in a simple, well-tailored dark suit. He looked calm, composed, and completely out of place in the chaos. "What are you doing here?" Clara snapped, her voice raw. "Have you come to gloat, to watch them take the last of our things?" "He's probably looking for a handout," Marcus sneered, his fear curdling into baseless aggression. "Now that your gravy train has run out." Eleanor fixed Leo with a look of pure loathing. "This is all because of you," she said, her voice low and venomous. "Your weakness, your bad luck. You were a curse on this family from the day my daughter brought you home." Leo listened to their accusations without a word, his expression unreadable. He waited for them to finish, for their impotent rage to subside into ragged breaths. The room fell silent, the only sound the scraping of a heavy crate being dragged across the marble floor in the foyer. Then he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it filled the empty room, each word perfectly weighted and clear. "You're right," he said. "This is because of me." The three of them stared at him, confused. Clara let out a short, hysterical laugh. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. You couldn't organize a bake sale, let alone a corporate takedown. You're nothing, Leo. You've always been nothing." It was the word that broke the dam. Nothing. "You spent 10 years telling me I was nothing," Leo said, taking a slow step forward. "You spent 10 years treating me like a fool, a pet project, a piece of furniture you were embarrassed by. You mocked my work. You belittled my passions. You stood in a room full of your shallow, sycophantic friends and announced to the world that I peaked at nothing." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze steady and unforgiving. "But what you didn't know," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is that while you were chasing shiny objects and building a life on debt and deception, my family was building the world you were so desperate to buy into." He let that sentence land. He saw the flicker of confusion in their eyes, the first glimmer of a terrifying, impossible thought. "That anonymous tip to the SEC, that was me. The loan recall that bankrupted your firm, I authorized it. The hostile takeover that stripped Julian of his company, I signed the papers." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the old silver key, holding it up for them to see. "This belonged to my grandfather, the quiet, unassuming watchmaker you all condescended to at our wedding. He was also the founder and sole owner of a company you might have heard of recently. He looked directly at Clara, her face now a canvas of dawning horror. Ethelred Industries, it's mine! The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. It was too immense, too impossible to comprehend. Marcus stopped pacing, his mouth hanging open. Eleanor stumbled back a step, her hand flying to her throat as if to stop a gasp. Clara just stared, her mind frantically trying to process the words, to find a flaw, an escape from the monstrous truth. The quiet librarian, the failed academic, the man she had called useless 1,000 times. He was the ghost. He was the architect of her annihilation. Her numbness shattered, replaced by a wave of pure, unadulterated hysteria. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, you're lying. You're insane." She lunged at him, her hands clawing, her face contorted in a mask of rage and disbelief. "You couldn't. You're not smart enough." Leo didn't flinch. He simply stood there as she beat her fists against his chest, her blows having no effect. When her energy was spent, she collapsed at his feet, her body racked with deep, agonizing sobs. Her world hadn't just been destroyed. It had been a lie from the very beginning. Her power, her wealth, her status, it had all been an illusion, unknowingly borrowed from the very man she despised. Marcus began to babble, a string of incoherent pleas for mercy. "Leo, please, I didn't know. We can make a deal. Please, you can't do this." Leo ignored him. He looked down at the pathetic, weeping form of his wife. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "A major news organization has been investigating Marcus's financial crimes for the past 2 weeks. They have everything. The story is breaking tomorrow morning." He let a small, cold smile touch his lips for the first time. "My face will be on the cover of every paper. The reclusive billionaire historian who cleaned up Wall Street. Ironic, isn't it?" As if on cue, the sound of sirens began to grow in the distance, a mournful wail cutting through the grey afternoon. Red and blue lights flashed against the windows of the empty room. Leo looked at the three of them one last time. The broken wife, the whimpering fraud, the shattered matriarch. He felt nothing. No pity, no triumph, just a quiet sense of order being restored. He turned, his back straight, and walked out of the house, not looking back. He left them to the wreckage and the approaching sound of a justice they had never believed would apply to them. The aftermath was exactly as Mr. Sterling had predicted: swift, public, and absolute. Marcus Vance was arrested that day, led from the empty mansion in handcuffs, a picture that graced the front page of the city's second-largest paper. The main story, however, belonged to Leo. His face, a serious and thoughtful portrait provided by Sterling's team, was indeed on the cover of every major publication. The story of the secret Ethelred heir, the quiet academic who had inherited a multi-billion-dollar empire and used it to expose a web of corruption, was a global sensation. Marcus was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and securities violations. His sentence was severe, a long stretch in a federal prison that stripped him of his tailored suits and smug confidence. He was just another number in a system he once thought he was above. Eleanor's fate was a social death. Stripped of her wealth and her name, now synonymous with scandal, she was exiled from the elite circles she had worked her entire life to dominate. Her powerful friends no longer answered her calls. She was forced to sell the last of her untainted jewelry and move into a small, bleak apartment in a part of the city she used to fly over in a helicopter. She lived out her days in bitter, impoverished obscurity. Clara, disgraced and penniless, attempted to sue Leo for half of his fortune, claiming spousal rights. But the prenuptial agreement, the very one she had insisted upon years ago to protect her family money from him, was ironclad. It guaranteed that all inherited assets remained separate property. Her own weapon had been turned against her. The lawsuit was dismissed, and she was left with nothing but legal bills she couldn't pay. The last Leo heard, she was working as a hostess at a chain restaurant. Her beauty faded, her eyes permanently shadowed with the bitterness of her downfall. Leo, however, did not embrace the life of a typical billionaire. He didn't buy a fleet of sports cars or a mega yacht. He moved out of the mansion of painful memories and into a modest, comfortable penthouse apartment overlooking the city library. The vast majority of his time and resources were funneled into a new endeavor, the Gable Foundation for Historical Preservation. He endowed universities, funded archaeological digs, and created programs to digitize and preserve fragile, ancient texts. He built libraries and museums, ensuring that the stories of the past would be protected for the future. His work earned him a different kind of respect, one based not on his net worth, but on his passion and intellect. He was no longer the man who peaked at nothing. He was the man who was building a legacy that would outlast them all. About a year after the dust had settled, he was giving a guest lecture at a university his foundation had supported. He spoke about the economic impact of the Hanseatic League, his voice filled with the same quiet passion it had always held. After the lecture, a woman with warm, intelligent eyes approached him. Her name was Dr. Anna Reed, the head of the university's history department. "That was a brilliant analysis, Mr. Vance," she said, her smile genuine. "Your insights on the Lubeck laws were particularly fascinating." They talked for over an hour, not about his money or his fame, but about history, about books, about the quiet joy of discovery. For the first time in over a decade, Leo felt seen. He felt understood. Anna saw the man his grandfather had raised, the scholar Clara had tried to extinguish. They began to meet for coffee, then dinner. A new, healthier love, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared passions, began to grow. A few years later, Leo and Anna stood together in the newly dedicated gable wing of the city's central library. It was a beautiful space, filled with natural light, the scent of old paper and new beginnings. Students and researchers worked quietly at long oak tables, surrounded by the books and manuscripts that Leo's foundation had saved. Anna squeezed his hand. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she whispered. Leo looked around the room, at the peaceful pursuit of knowledge, at the legacy he was building. He was at peace, his past a closed chapter in a long and complex history book. He had found his true peak, not in a moment of vengeful triumph, but in the quiet, enduring work of building something meaningful. True wealth, he had come to understand, wasn't measured in dollars or stock portfolios. It was measured in purpose, in integrity, and in the quiet strength to become exactly who you were meant to be, no matter what the world told you. True power lay not in what we display for others to see, but in the silent, invisible foundations we build for the future.